Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I am back again today doing another video, and the subject of today's video is going to be a bit different than things that I normally focus on. So normally, if you haven't been on the channel much, this is essentially a completely NBA related channel. I do focus on the NFL occasionally when it's like the beginning of the season or time for the playoffs. I'll do my regular season predictions or playoff predictions, but either way, today I'm doing something a bit different. I'm venturing into film, which is something I have also been very interested in throughout my life. I would consider myself a cinephile, which if you don't know what that is, that's somebody who greatly loves and is interested in both watching and discussing movies. And so today I'm going to be doing one of my first ventures into the film side of what this channel might be, and that is going to be focusing on ranking all of Quentin Tarantino's movies, 9 to 1. Yes, I'm going to be counting the Kill Bills as one movie because that's how Quentin Tarantino wants it to be distinguished. I will distinguish within that film itself which half of the movie I like better, Volume 1 or Volume 2. So without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off at number 9, the last movie, the one that I am pretty indifferent on, don't really care for, is Death Proof. Starring Kurt Russell, I feel that it's a movie that just basically is Quentin Tarantino diving into something that he likes, but he's not really considering his audience much. I feel like it's a lot of empty violence. Kurt Russell is basically killing these chicks or at least trying to kill these chicks for a lot of a movie and then killing them at the end. And I just feel like it's kind of just empty violence and there's not as much of a story as he usually puts in, and the dialogue itself isn't as great either. It's just there. Um, yeah, I don't have much to say really about this movie because it doesn't really last with me like many of its other ones. I think about afterwards and they last with me, but this one doesn't really last with me. I think Kurt Russell's it does a good job in it, but I think the chicks are just okay, and I kind of get the feeling that they're gonna die beforehand just based on how the whole thing's going, and then when they do die, it's like, well, that's what I expected, and the violence is pretty gruesome too, and I don't know, it just doesn't have the story to pull me in, and the characters aren't charismatic enough to make me care really. Okay, moving on to number 8. This is where I'm putting Kill Bill. People are probably gonna say it's way too low, but hear me out. And let me just distinguish here. I like Kill Bill Volume 2 better than Kill Bill Volume 1, which is also a much more unpopular opinion than what most people hold. But to me, Kill Bill is similar to Death Proof in that it's just a lot of like Quentin Tarantino doing something that he likes but not really considering his audience much. He basically is saying, I have a crush on Uma Thurman, and he's making a movie all about Uma Thurman, and I know he likes samurais a lot, so he makes a samurai movie, and that's fine. But I feel like at least for part one, it focuses a lot more on like shock value violence. Like, let me um, when Uma Thurman goes to fight O-Ren and she cuts off the top of her scalp, and you just see a big bloody brain, and Uma Thurman's like holding her scalp. That part is just disgusting. There's tons of scenes where, like when O-Ren is taking out all those gangsters in the middle of the movie of part one, where she's like cutting off dudes' heads and blood is squirting like it's a fountain. It's just a little too much for me. I get that he's sort of trying to emulate those old samurai Japanese movies from way back in the day, like the 50s and 60s, but because those movies always had like blood squirting like that when people got killed or decapitated. But to me, it just doesn't hit right. It feels like a samurai movie imitation rather than a samurai movie. And then also for part one, I don't feel like it has as much story as it could. Like, yes, there's some background information, but really, she takes care of the first one. I'm forgetting what the character's name is, but it's played by I think Vivica Fox, and it's the black woman on the team, and she takes care of her in like 5 minutes, and then she spends like 2 hours trying to take down O-Ren, played by Lucy Liu, and I just feel like it doesn't flow as well because like you'd think that each of these people are pretty badass and that they could hold their own, but yet she has to take 2 hours to take down one character, and she has to take down the other one in 5 minutes. It just doesn't hold up for me. And yes, there's a lot of background mixed in there, but in essence, it's like the whole movie is about O-Ren, and then there's like 5 minutes on one of the other five members that she's trying to take down. So there just wasn't much of a balance to me. and the story is very slow in part one. Part two, it speeds up quite a bit because it's building on all the groundwork that part one has laid. And there's more story, I think, in that you get her taking on a lot more of these characters like Michael Madsen, Daryl Hannah, and Carradine, which is the actual Bill character. But I don't know, the tone is really weird too. Like she's kind of a badass throughout the whole thing, but then it slows down a lot when they show her flashbacks of when she went to train, so that makes it off balance. And then it really throws off the balance of the whole thing, I think, when at the end, when she's kind of on this badass rampage, then when her little daughter comes in, and then I feel like the balance is really off there because you got this sort of climactic buildup, and then you kind of pause that for 10 minutes for her to hang out with a little kid, and you're kind of just like waiting, like, okay, let's put the kid to sleep, and then have this fight between her and Bill. And I just think that they almost could have like had the little kid be asleep, and then like after she kills Bill, she finds out that her daughter is alive, and then she goes and says like, I'm your mom, or something like that. And because that would be a better falling action, I think, than kind of having your falling action of her discovering her daughter before the actual climax. But okay, those are the only two Quentin Tarantino's movies that I don't really like. So those are out of the way, and now basically these next seven are all ones that I really enjoy. So it's like whether I put them higher or lower, just know that I do really enjoy all these movies, and so it's I'm not trying to slight any of them by putting them higher or lower on this list. So at number seven, I have The Hateful Eight. I think it's a good movie. I think it's very much a style that Quentin Tarantino likes. He likes to do these sort of like stage plays where it's honestly a more like a theater production rather than a movie actually, which is what Hateful Eight is, because essentially the whole movie takes place in one room, which is much like a theater production. And I think this movie is honestly like a spiritual follow up to what like Reservoir Dogs was, which is a similar thing, all in one room. Um, Hateful Eight, it's a pretty long movie. I think it's about 3 hours. It's like 2 hours 50 minutes, something like that. Um, and it is very good. I like Samuel L. Jackson's character. I like the cast a lot. You know, all the people from Bruce Dern to Michael Madsen to Tim Roth and Jennifer Jason Leigh, Kurt Russell. They all do a good job in this movie. I like Kurt Russell's character a lot, and it has enough twists and turns to keep you interested. And there isn't the ending is it's what I would expect. It actually is a lot like the ending of Reservoir Dogs in a certain way, but there just isn't as many twists and turns as Reservoir Dogs. It sort of feels like he kind of tried to rehash Reservoir Dogs, but in a different setting, and kind of pass it off as a different idea. But it really feels very similar to me, but it is still good. Let's see here. At number six, I have Django Unchained, which I like, and a lot of people have it a lot higher than me on their list than number six. Uh, I think my only flaw with this movie is two things. Number one, I feel like they try and pass off Django as the main character, but really I feel like Christoph Waltz's character should be much more of the main character. When he's on screen, which is for about 80% of the movie, he is like nonstop talking, whereas Django is just kind of in the background in their scenes together, and Django is like not talking at all. So I feel like Christoph Waltz is much more in the lead. He did win an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for this, but I thought 100% he was the lead. And then number two is that I don't find the Django character enduring whatsoever. I don't connect with him at all. Uh, I don't wish ill upon him. He's our protagonist, so we're supposed to want him to do well and succeed in the end. But I feel like we're just in the beginning we're expected to just like him basically because he's a slave and not because we connect with him at all. And I think it would have been they should have made him a bit more of a lively, charismatic character, or just give him some sort of likability, because to me he has no likability to him, and because of that I can't really connect to him. And it's not like he's a bad guy. He just doesn't have anything that makes me say like, "Oh, I should like this character," besides the fact that like slavery is an awful thing, and so because of that we naturally support his character. Um, but yeah, I mean, the plot's pretty good. I like lots of twists and turns, and the shootout at the end is pretty entertaining, I have to admit. And Leonardo DiCaprio really hams it up in this movie, and he does a good job. Um, the rest of the cast is pretty good too. Yeah, you have a good cast, and you have good dialogue. It is again a bit long. I think it's in the 2 hours 40, 2 hours 45 minutes range, but uh, you know, it pads it out well, and the plot kind of demands a lot of time. There are a few sequences that you could cut out, but overall, I think the timing is fine with this movie. At number five, I have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, his most recent movie. A movie that I think is going to be very underappreciated and could be maybe forgotten in years and years from now when people think of Quentin Tarantino movies. But I think I have a few things to say about it that I think are true and will resonate with those who also enjoyed it. And if you didn't, just try and hear out what I'm saying here. I think of any of Quentin Tarantino's movies, this may be the best shot of any of them. The camera work is phenomenal. I love the coloration that they have in this movie, just the way the aesthetics, the way they make Los Angeles look, uh, the way they did up all the characters. Like Brad Pitt and Leo just look so cool and so good in this movie, and they just did a really like the aesthetics are just like perfect in this movie. I love the way the sunlight hits the characters in certain scenes, and it feels really hazy. Whereas like a movie like Pulp Fiction, yeah, like Pulp Fiction is a great example. Also shot in Los Angeles, but it doesn't feel hazy. It just feels like a regular metropolitan area. It could be honestly anywhere. Like Pulp Fiction could take place in any major North American city, whereas like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood does this great job of being like very distinctly Los Angeles, I feel like. Besides that, the major drawback I think most people would point to of this movie is that the plot is very meandering and there's really no point to it. But I think that just comes from the angle of people who don't really understand the concept of a slice of life plot line. Many successful movies do a slice of life, which is what this movie is. It means that you're not necessarily taking like a beginning, a rising action, a climax, a falling action, and a conclusion. It's more just like you're seeing the day in a life of a certain interesting character historically. So like another example of this would be a movie like Inside Llewyn Davis by the Coen Brothers. That movie doesn't have a rising action, a climax, or blah blah blah. It just has like 48 hours in the life of Llewyn Davis, and you get to see like what the dude goes through on a daily basis. But it doesn't necessarily have like something that needs to be resolved or anything. Much like this movie, it's just taking these two interesting characters, Cliff Booth and which is played by Brad Pitt, and Rick Dalton played by Leo, and just showing like what life as a meddling actor in Hollywood is like, and what life for a stuntman is like. And Brad Pitt is one of the coolest Tarantino characters I've ever seen in any of his movies. In this one, Cliff Booth is just like Joe Cool, and they don't do much with the Manson stuff, honestly. And I think that people ranking this movie lower. They went into it expecting basically like a Charlie Manson biopic, which is not ever what this movie was supposed to be. Uh, Tarantino was just using it more as a backdrop for this other interesting um, kind of fairy tale plot that he had come up with about actors in Hollywood for Leo and Brad Pitt. And those guys aren't going to win Oscars for this movie, but they do some dang good acting. Yeah, I like this movie a lot, despite there not being uh, a really tight plot or anything like that. It definitely is the least Tarantino of any of his movies, I would say, in that it doesn't have the sort of it doesn't have the feisty dialogue that his movies normally have. It just has like smooth, realistic dialogue, which is a staple of his, but it's not like as feisty or as uh, bickery as his movies' characters' dialogues normally are. And he doesn't really care about a plot in this movie, and there's really very little violence actually. So in a lot of ways, it's very not Tarantino-like, but I still enjoy it quite a bit. Moving on, next is at number four, Jackie Brown. I think a very underrated movie. I think probably the most underrated and least talked about of Quentin Tarantino's movies. Uh, he did adapt this from a book, but it is still very Tarantino-like. The conversations are very realistic, very uh, flow very naturally, like real people would talk. I like it a lot. I think it's one of Robert De Niro's most underrated performances as a supporting player in it. He has these really nuanced scenes where he's really reserved, and that's not normally his forte. He's normally a loud, brash kind of guy a lot of times who like is a mobster in control. In this one, he plays basically a beta to Samuel L. Jackson. Pam Grier does a great job in this movie. The what's his name? Robert Forster got an Oscar nomination, and he does a great job playing Max Cherry, who's one of the coolest Tarantino characters I've ever seen. And this movie, it really focuses on a tight plot. I think it's one of the tightest plots of any Tarantino movies out there. And a lot of his other movies can really dive deep into uh, kind of just setting up backstory for characters and kind of taking a lot of exposition-esque scenes where they just talk and shoot the breeze and just chat for a while. And this movie doesn't do that. The plot is very tight, and that's something different for his movies. And it is a long movie, still like 2.5 hours, but it's got a very intricate plot, and it really just needs all that time to pad out that plot rather than just having characters go on long monologues and soliloquies. It has a tight plot, which I like a lot. Number three, Pulp Fiction. Again, probably a lot lower than a lot of you think it should be. Well, I'll tell you why basically. I think Pulp Fiction is great. I think that it has a lot of cool characters. I think that the plot is interesting. But I think that Tarantino is still testing stuff out at this stage of his career. He wasn't fully formed as a complete filmmaker yet. And I think some of my quips with this movie, or some of my not problems with it, but if I had to find any sort of like things to point at that say make it less than perfect, to me, it takes a lot of time to just pad with monologues and like people talking about like pop culture and stuff. And I watched it recently, and I just had a few scenes where I was like, this is like interesting, and it shows that Quentin has a lot of knowledge of pop culture, but it doesn't really need to be in this movie. And it's interesting, but it doesn't really add anything to the movie besides proving like Quentin Tarantino really knows his pop culture. Um, like at Jackrabbit Slims, a lot of that stuff, like yes, they have good back and forth, and the dialogue is very realistic, but like when they describe like what a pilot is, that's not really like necessary. Other big or other major problems that I have with this movie, not major problems, but minor ones, is I can never see Uma Thurman and Ving Rhames being an actual couple. They share one brief scene together in the movie where they don't even talk to each other or interact, where they're just kind of like standing by each other. And yeah, I don't buy that. I don't buy them as a couple really. I don't see them being realistic. I think that not that Uma Thurman. Oh, they should have just cast one of them differently, because to me they don't hit me at all as a couple. She's kind of this woman that strikes me as being very, I don't know how to describe it, but European, and he's kind of like a hard hitting dude who comes from the streets, and she doesn't seem like she would ever want to be with him, and actually vice versa. He didn't seem like he'd ever want to be with her. So that's like a plot, not hole, but just kind of a flaw, I think. Another one is like the whole GIMP thing. I read an interview once where someone asked like Quentin Tarantino, like, what's the whole point of like the GIMP and the basically the rape plot line as a whole? And he said essentially like, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I basically was looking to keep the audience on their toes and get some shock value. And I think just openly admitting that, I don't really like that, because it says like this doesn't necessarily serve a purpose besides like making you drop your jaw. And yes, there could be some hidden purpose that he could spin off for it, but I think I just I just don't really see it. You could have cut that whole part out, and I always kind of was like, well, what's the meaning of all this? And then when I read that interview and he was just saying like, I just was trying to create shock value, it kind of disappointed me. Um, and that's fine. He can make whatever film he wants and do whatever he wants in it. That's just something that I always didn't really like about it. Now, my final thing about Pulp Fiction, and I'm only coming up with so many negatives for this movie because so many people out there are gonna say it's the perfect movie, it's the perfect movie, it's the best movie ever made, blah blah blah. Well, my last quip with it, I think it honestly could have worked better in chronological order. Why do I say that? I have watched it in chronological order, where all the scenes are edited to be what the chronological order would be, and I liked it better. I find the original, when it's just out of chronological order and you jump around, it feels much more like a mini series, and I'm watching like all the episodes of a mini series back to back to back, rather than like a movie. Like it feels like when you watch them after Bruce Willis kills John Travolta, but then John Travolta pops back up at the end. It sort of feels like you're watching a TV show, and it's like an anthology series or something. Whereas when I put it in chronological order, you really get this more clear picture of like John Travolta being more of a lead than he feels like throughout the rest of it. And I don't ever like I never liked that like they made you feel like he was alive at the end when really he was dead. I didn't like that portion of it. Um, I just like movies in chronological order, honestly, and I feel like again, I feel like the putting things out of chronological order is really just trying to like provide shock value for the audience, which I don't really need shock value. I just like watching a cohesive movie. That's all I have to say. I love Pulp Fiction. It's a really good movie. The dialogue is really good, characters are really good, but those are just some of the quips for why I don't have it as my number one. My number two, I have Reservoir Dogs. Yes, many people think that this one should be lower too. They think Tarantino isn't fully developed as a filmmaker yet. He hasn't come into his own yet. Well, I disagree. I think that this movie is definitely the tightest movie of any of Tarantino's. There's no wasted time necessarily in this movie. I do think that they reference the N word way too much in this movie for being a cast of all white dudes. I think that's my only gripe with this movie. Besides that, it has a really tight script. The storyline is tight. There's no like wasted time, I don't think. You know, all the cutaways, and this one actually has a lot of scenes that are out of chronological order as well, but they serve as kind of like backgrounds on a lot of the characters. And yeah, I like it a lot. I think it's actually one of the only Tarantino movies to have a huge twist in it, which it did with the revealing that Tim Roth is actually the cop. Sorry if you haven't seen it, but that's the sort of the big twist of the movie is that there's all these criminals and basically one of them is a rat that ratted them out to the police, and it turns out that Tim Roth was an undercover cop the whole time. Um, yeah, I like that twist a lot. I think Harvey Keitel puts in one of my favorite performances of his. Quentin Tarantino does arguably some of the most acting he's done in any of his movies in this one, and he's only in like one and a half scenes really. Let's see here. Steve Buscemi turns in what might be my favorite Steve Buscemi role in this movie. Michael Madsen probably does his best work of any of his movies in this one. Yeah, it is really good stuff. And if you haven't seen it, go see it. It's his shortest movie by far. It's only an hour and a half, and that's what I mean by being tight. Like he doesn't bloat it with just putting in like, look at all this dialogue that I can write. He just kind of keeps it simple and sticks to the plot rather than going on huge monologues, and it just works really, really well. And last, and definitely not least, at number one, the movie that I think is Quentin Tarantino's best film is Inglourious Basterds. Why do I think this? It's kind of got everything that Quentin Tarantino does, and he does it arguably the best in this movie, especially for my taste too, because like as I say, I'm not a huge fan of not going in chronological order. In this movie, he stays in chronological order, so it's not a deal breaker or anything, but it's something that I like. What else does he have? He has really good dialogue, really good monologues, but also I don't think that they detract from the movie. So what I mean by that is like sometimes in some of his other movies, a character's just going on and on and on, and I'm saying to myself in my head like, okay, I feel like this could be cut short. But in this movie, I don't really get much of that. Christoph Waltz has that really good monologue. The first scene is like a 12-minute long scene, and it doesn't feel like it should be cut whatsoever. And it's just basically Christoph Waltz doing a huge monologue. I think it's really well done. Christoph Waltz is one of the best characters that Quentin's ever written. And I think the whole alternate history thing is really interesting as well, let me add, with the plot. The plot is so good in this movie. And the only things that I can point to that are faults with it, with this movie in particular, are that um, the Brad Pitt accent. I think it's supposed to be sort of comedic, honestly, but it's not great. Maybe it's supposed to be bad, and I just haven't picked up on that, but it's pretty awful. um, yeah, that's probably the only fault I can find with this movie. I love the bar scene with Michael Fassbender. He's a dude who he's listed as like the fifth in billing on this movie, and he's in really like two scenes of the whole movie. But just because one of his scenes is like 15 minutes long, and it's like a 15-minute straight of just him in the bar scene, then he gets higher billing. So I love that scene a lot. I love the opening scene a lot. I think how they told the alternate history plotline at the movie theater at the end was really good. Um, he gets the best out of his performances between Melanie Laurent and Diane Kruger. and all the dudes in Brad Pitt's sort of Jewish brigade. I like them all a lot. Yeah, this movie is, I think, his best. Just it's the perfect intersection point of his really good dialogue with a really good plot that he worked equally hard on. And yeah, I love it, and I think that if you haven't seen it, you should go out and watch all these movies. They're all worth seeing at least once. Many of them are worth seeing definitely more than once. You just gotta have a lot of time on your hands because almost all of them are gonna take up about 3 hours of your life. That's all I got for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it interesting. Leave a comment below with your own order or your thoughts on my ordering of all these, and I'll see you next time. Bye.